Just give, great. So we'll just give another moment or two to allow more people to arrive. All right, I think we can get started. Welcome to ProutSpace for February. We are lucky to have Dada Krishnasevananda with us today, and as I'm sure all of you saw in the advertisement or the information about ProutSpace for 2026, we're kind of changing format into a seminar and discussion format, whereas we had been focusing more on projects in the last year. And so Dada Krishnasevananda is a monk and meditation teacher of Ananda Marga with over 40 years of experience in spiritual teaching, community development, and international service work. He currently helps guide the community at Ananda Gauri in Denmark, where he is now. And Dada's going to talk about these recent developments we're seeing in Greenland, including geopolitical tensions with the US and Denmark, and how these shifts open up new opportunities for PROUT thinking and approaches in the global community and economic transformation. So we're very lucky to have Dada here, and I'm going to hand it over to him. We'll have about an hour and a half of discussion time, or of time together, and if we finish before then, we will. But I imagine there's a lot to explore together here. So Dada, I will hand it over to you.
Namaskar. So thank you for showing up, and thanks to ProutSpace for inviting me. I don't feel particularly qualified to be the speaker on this topic, but I only said yes because I'm excited by the topic, and it's sparking off all sorts of ideas. And the ideas continue to spark. So that's what I'll probably be sharing, is a lot of sparks that may not be laid out in the most organized fashion. But I'd like to start with just looking at the what's happening and some questions about why it's happening. So with Trump's threats against just about everybody, including Greenland, what has led to this? I think it's just a continuation of what's been happening over quite a long time. So with the kind of globalization that was kind of the norm, what happened in that was that the US and Europe gradually shifted production over to the East, and this created problems for their own working class. So downward pressure on wages, loss of industries and jobs. And gradually, the industrial capacity shifted from the east, from the west to the east. And suddenly, Europe and the United States are realizing that globalization isn't favoring them anymore. And so the shift to more aggressive policies, so to protect themselves through tariffs, etc. And I'm wondering, and this is just a speculation, that that the U.S. is realizing that it can't win this global game, and that's part of the reason of kind of shifting back towards the United States, so it can assert its sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which includes Greenland, and maybe is tacitly saying, okay, let Russia battle it out with Europe over Eastern Europe, and let China battle it out with other countries over Asia. So the great power rivalries are kind of forcing a move in a Proutistic, an unwilling move in a Proutistic direction. And that is kind of more regional self-reliance. And there are signs that China is also realizing this. So the situation for the middle powers is that the great powers are now kind of giving up on this, the previous kind of agreements about international trade, and are trying to strengthen their own superpower dominance in their particular area. So the attack on Venezuela, the threats against Denmark and Greenland, and the withdrawal from the EU, and saying that the EU has to look after its own defense. And this is causing the middle powers to kind of think about, how do we protect ourselves? And the question that comes up in my mind is whether this could be a kind of a proto-new UN in a PROUT style, so a world government. So the middle powers make alliances amongst themselves to protect themselves, and then they find out that that works, actually. And as that idea of making alliances with other middle powers grows, and it seems to be effective, which there are some examples that it has, like Canada and Europe, with strengthening their defense and making some kind of collective agreement to increase their defense cooperation in Greenland and in the northern area, suddenly makes it more difficult for the US to be aggressive without any kind of serious consequences. So my question is, will the penny start to drop? And can we as Proutists encourage that penny to drop? That, okay, let's take it further. This middle power alliance is happening. Why don't we extend that to a concept of all the middle powers uniting around the world and forming some kind of world government without the Security Council, without the big superpowers? And then that united power of the middle powers is strong enough to make the superpowers realize that they can't have their way so easily, and that they are finally brought to the table because they don't really have that much choice. So that's my idealistic, Proutistic speculation. Maybe we can just break for some comments and thoughts about that. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts about this idea? Okay. So if something comes up later, then, I mean, obviously a strong world government, this is a chance for us to promote the idea of the need for a strong world government so that middle powers can protect themselves. And just put that thought in your mind. Maybe what's happening in the world now is a kind of proto-movement in that direction as the middle powers reach out and make alliances amongst themselves. The next thing I'd like to talk about is that this kind of aggression from the US and the pulling out of the US from Europe has forced Europe and the Nordic countries to think a lot more about alliances amongst themselves, military alliances. But one thing that there is a need for regional security and regional self-reliance. And there are many aspects of this happening. And let me just give a few examples of that. Well, the recent Nordic Defense Alliance, much tighter focus on regional security in terms of, improving industrial production and so forth, defense alliances. But one thing is being left out, and that is the importance of a strong local demand for a strong local economy. So there have been rising inequality in Europe, which is part of the reason for this rise in populism. And if your population, if your own economy is weak, if you don't have a strong local demand and you are dependent upon exports and imports, then that makes you very vulnerable in a kind of chaotic global situation. So one thing that we can argue as Proutists, it is that it's not only military alliances and it's not only international alliances like between Canada and Europe and so forth, that is going to be important in this new world order of, superpowers trying to exert their dominance in their fields. The other thing that is going to be important is self-reliant local economies, which the most important ingredient of that is that people have purchasing power. And that's what makes a healthy economy. So in the Nordic countries and in many places of Europe and in the United States, local purchasing power has been going down and down. And it's not only a result of globalization. So this is another favorable situation towards the PROUT idea of improve the purchasing capacity of the people, and that as an essential aspect in creating a self-reliant, creating an economy and a country and a region that is able to not be dramatically negatively affected by these types of global fluctuations. And I would like to share some examples of countries which were formerly very much focusing on exports, economic success through exports. So they were like Japan and Korea. So I'm going to share my screen here. Where did that go? So Japan was a major exporter and kind of got reached the limits of, its prosperity was built a lot on exports. But the realization that it can't compete against China and that, being able to dominate in the in the export sphere isn't going to any longer be their ticket for success, that realization is going there, and they're making changes in that regard. So the new prime minister said, the era of cheap labor as a competitive advantage is over. To secure Japan's future, we must ensure that the fruits of growth are returned to the workers. Our goal is a virtuous cycle of growth, right? One of the leaders of the Japanese business groups said, we must move away from cost-cutting management, investing in people through historic wage hikes. This is not an expense. It is the most critical capital investment for the 21st century. And part of Japan's success in Japan had one of the lowest inequality ratios in the 1960s and 70s. And that historical example showed that the strength of Japan lies in the fact that we are a nation, this is a quote, of 100 million stakeholders. When every citizen identifies as middle class, the domestic market becomes an unbreakable fortress. And there was some statistic that I think was the prime minister who said that 85% of last year's growth in the economy was due to domestic market, right? Not international sales. So that is a huge shift from a major exporting country to a country which is focusing on a Proutistic style of, build up your local economy, produce for your local needs from your local resources. And the same is happening in Korea. Here's a quote from the leader of the opposition. Capitalism is failing because wealth is pooling at the top, while the pockets of the people are empty. We must implement a universal basic income and strengthen local purchasing power to prevent the collapse of our domestic economy. So Korea also in competition with China. So many countries, including China itself, are starting to realize that this kind of global competition is just one of winners and losers, and you can't be the winner all the time, and that the most important thing is to strengthen your own local economy. In Germany, Robert Habeck said, "We can no longer rely on external empires for our energy or our markets. We must strengthen our domestic resilience. True sovereignty means having a population that can afford to sustain its own industries." When essential prices spike, the purchasing power of the poor is wiped out. The state must step in to guarantee minimum necessities. Well, that sounds very Proutistic to me. So my point is that America's aggression towards Greenland and aggression towards Canada and the EU and its increasing protectionism is forcing people to think in more Proutistic ways, and our role can be to just help extend that natural tendency being forced by the circumstances to further logical Proutistic realizations or directions. And there was one thing that I missed saying earlier, that so as countries try to protect themselves, not everybody is accepting the idea. They're at the same time trying to increase their export market. So the old habit or the old system of dominance by exports or prosperity through exports, they're still trying to hold on to that. So, but maybe more by exerting their influence in their own local sphere. Now, what happens when you have these two contradicting forces? So on the one hand, you're trying to import less and be more self-reliant, but at the same time, you're trying to expand your export markets. So this is an inevitable conflict. If you don't want to import and you want to build your own industries, and at the same time, you're trying to find markets, that's what's bringing us back to the old mercantilist era. And that was a situation where, kind of Britain and France and the United States were exerting their, just basically at war on different levels, trying to get markets for their exports and also trying to protect against, receiving imports. So that's just the situation that we're in now. Has been the result of the West kind of getting grumpy and losing out on what it previously dominated in the globalization trend. So as the West becomes the loser in globalization, it's shifting towards this more, kind of protect our own interests. But that leads towards war, in the sense of, what I just described, this inevitable, you can't everybody can't be self-reliant and be international exporters also. So someone's going to lose. Okay. So, neo-mercantilism forcing us in Proutistic directions. So I also talked about, and I'm not talking that much about Greenland. I'm talking more about what happened in Greenland as a kind of stimulus for dramatic changes around the world, and not just what happened in Greenland, but as a kind of consistent manifestation. I mean, that may be also Taiwan. It's the same thing happening, as Russia and Europe is trying to expand its cheap labor and markets eastward towards Russia. Russia wants to do the opposite and expand westward. So there's inevitable conflict coming there. So part of the way in this, as long as this situation of, large blocks trying to expand and protect themselves at the same time, there is this need amongst everybody else, including us, to protect ourselves. And that we see efforts being made in that direction. But one effort that needs to be made more, and that Proutists can help encourage, is the need towards, or the movement towards a strong economies based on strong local purchasing power. So there was one interesting statistic I wanted to share. So the Gini coefficient shows the level of equality or inequality in a country. And the smaller it is, the more equal people are. The higher it is, the more inequality there is. So just looking at the Nordic countries, with the exception I brought in Japan there, they are moving towards greater and greater inequality. So in the best years of equality, in Sweden in 1982, the Gini coefficient was 20, whereas in 2026, it's 29.3. And that is a 46.5% increase in inequality. And this is, Sweden is the neoliberal laboratory, the most aggressive shift towards wealth concentration. In Finland, it's accelerating. They had 20.1 in 1986, and now they're at 26.1. They have 10.4% unemployment. In Denmark, it's risen from 22 to 28. In Norway, from 22 to 26.5. In Japan, from 24.9 to 32. In Greenland, it's going the opposite direction. And I did a little bit of research why, but I'll get into that later. So obviously the kind of neoliberal increase in influence, or the neoliberal influence in the Nordic countries, is pushing things in the wrong direction as far as having a strong, healthy economy based on strong demand, right? But there has been some recent research about this, especially a very modern research, which is showing. Where can I find that? Okay, so in the past, the Nordic model of high taxes, decent wages, and high level of public spending on infrastructure and social services meant that Nordic economies did well. And, where a lot of Europe was suffering a lot economically, the Nordic countries were doing a lot better. But the reasons for that are going in the wrong direction. So as we just saw. And there were some recent studies that showed that, where was I don't have that quote easily to hand, but a recent study showed that a 5% increase in wages would create an equivalent 1% increase in gross domestic product. So that the study was showing that, contrary to the neoliberal teachings, if you put money into wages, it demonstrates, it can be measured, that actually increases the overall health of the economy. So our role here then as PROUTists is we can say that recent research is proving that, and that this is essential for, having a strong economy is one of the essential components of being able to survive when great powers are putting pressure and supplies, withdrawing support, and so forth. Yeah, that was that quote I was looking for. So other countries are realizing this much faster than the West. So that quote from Japan is no longer an export-led economy. Domestic demand now accounts for nearly 85 to 90% of our total GDP growth. Our national strategy must therefore pivot the Shunto spring wage offensive. So they're attempting to increase wages by 5% every year within 2 years. Is no longer just a labor negotiation. It is our primary engine of national economic security, right? It is our primary engine of national economic security. So Western countries, Scandinavia, Europe, the United States, need to recognize that. And I think that's one of the messages that we can put out. So there are movements in the right direction as far as regional alliances are concerned, and resisting great powers through cooperative defense and industrial policies and so forth. And these may themselves, as more emphasis is put on strengthening local industry, that may help in employment. But there's a contradiction between that and the kind of neoliberal tendencies which are dominating, especially in Finland, for example, and the United States. Another question that I'd like to, get your opinions on was that Trump and all the current crop of populist leaders represent the beginnings of Shudra revolution. Oh, I don't need to share this now. So, with declining wages, increasing unemployment, the loss of jobs to China and Japan and so forth, of course, the more and more people are suffering, more and more people are reduced to the role of being the Shudras, and they are angry. And the populist politicians pick up on that, and what they are doing, they are angry against globalization. They are angry against inequality and the elites. They are angry against immigrants taking their jobs. Yeah. And so this is, although it's not properly directed, the populist leaders represent, to me, the first stirrings of this Shudra revolution, because as the numbers increase and they have votes, they are able to vote for the people that represent their anger. And those people may be just exploiting that anger, but it is representing the growing power of the Shudras. And Shudra, mentality may express itself through anger and the desire to destroy and so forth. So some kinds of revolution is happening and is, will grow inevitably in momentum. But what it needs is not just guidance against globalization, but guidance against inequality within the country. So many of these leaders are they're populist leaders, but they're giving tax breaks to the rich and, not really dealing with the main issue about inequality. And if we look at historical examples, we can see that, when that happened in the past, those who successfully dealt with the situation put a focus on creating jobs, public works, and so forth, and got out of the near revolutionary crisis by putting money in the pockets of the people, by creating jobs. So this is again an opportunity for us to promote the ideas of PROUT and to give examples that some people are getting it and being successful at it. So examples from Korea about this pivot towards a local purchasing capacity, Japan, etc., even in China. So China is also realizing that, although it is aggressively competing and trying to find as many markets as it can, it is also understanding that the domestic market is the most important thing in the future for its survival. And it just occurred to me that, Baba talked a long time ago about, that China would attack Japan. So as the US tries to dominate in its own sphere, as Russia and the EU and Europe, and as Western Europe and Russia kind of compete for Eastern Europe, so also China and India will be the big powers that will be competing with each other and fighting with each other in the East. So, this changing situation makes that scenario of not only China invading Taiwan, but China invading India as a result of this pressure becoming ever more likely. Okay, so I wanted to maybe come a little bit more specific on inside Greenland. So whereas all the Nordic countries, the inequality has been increasing, inequality in Greenland has been decreasing. And it's still higher than the other Nordic countries, but it's on a downward trend. And some of the reasons for that can be about that there is this kind of indigenous spirit of collective ownership and collective welfare that is having an influence. So Greenland's main industry is fishing, and previously the fishing industry has been dominated by large companies and big commercial interests. But the government has been putting a lot of focus on strengthening local fishing. So they've been creating policies. I don't know the details of them, but they've been putting up, trying to make it easier and to support economically through subsidies and so forth, local fishermen to get their own boats and that kind of thing. So a shift from the big companies to a focus on small scale buildup of the local fishing industry. And that's one of the major reasons why the kind of the inequality gap is coming down. So I think in as far as Greenland is concerned, and as far as anywhere where PROUT is, where there are indigenous people, there is. I think we can look at the parallel between the indigenous culture of collective stewardship or collective ownership, and that not only people but animals and trees and all creatures share ownership or share the world, and that the indigenous culture of kind of a more community focused culture rather than a materialistic culture, kind of and the indigenous spiritual outlook is very much more connected to PROUT's idea of neo-humanism and collective ownership. So I think as PROUTists we can also point out those parallels and point out those parallels as a direction forward. So if we talk about Finland or Norway or Sweden, we can refer to local examples of a more collective approach. So local examples through indigenous culture, but also international examples such as Japan, Korea, China, which are putting a huge focus on strengthening their local purchasing capacity. And this is very recent also. These are, I won't say it's been universally adopted. Maybe Japan is at the forefront. I think the Chinese Communist Party is, kind of making that shift too. And maybe these ideas are gaining traction in Korea. Okay, I think those are most of the points that I wanted to make. Let me, culture, spiritualities, or government. Yeah. Okay, so those are my main points. So the background is this, kind of collapse of the trade agreements from globalization, which is pushing countries and pushing the world towards more self-reliant strategies. There's a conflict between kind of trying to be. I think this is one of the things that made America so angry about working in Japan, because Japan always protected its own industries and didn't allow American imports, and then was exporting like anything to the U.S. So the U.S. is reacting against that, and Japan is responding, and other countries are responding by strengthening their own local domestic demand, China as well, and they see that as the future. So that is the trend. The trend is towards PROUT, but it doesn't go far enough. And we can, kind of say, well, look, if this is what's happening, the PROUT takes it even further. World government, self-reliant socio-economic zones, or Samaja, our focus on block level planning and increasing, putting ceilings on decreasing the inequality gap through guaranteed minimum requirements and ceilings. So, the whole thing of PROUT is suited to what's happening in the world today. And I think for the now, with these types of developments, people are much more ready to see that that's quite obvious. Seeing the rise of populism as the kind of the beginnings of the Shuddha revolution. So rather than seeing, there was probably a tendency amongst us as Margis to see people who support populist parties as kind of crude and ignorant and so forth, and us to be highly critical of them. But I think we need to see their complaints as legitimate. I think we have to understand it as the beginning of this Shuddha revolution, and that it's inevitable, it's going to continue. And if it's not directed properly, it will be very violent and not very enlightened. So just we as Proutists should work with those disgruntled people who are being presently mobilized by the populists, and turn it in a different direction. Inuit culture and spirituality, I think we can draw those parallels there, especially amongst the young people who are looking for a world that isn't all about economics, that it touches their hearts and speaks to their spirituality and inner life. So neo-humanistic sentiments. People want a world where there's some love in it, and there's also where, the society and the philosophy behind the society speaks to their potential and inner needs. So in previous years, we focused on the spiritual aspect of PROUT, and I think that could appeal a lot to people in Greenland. They could see some sense of affinity there. Maybe we could even present it as kind of Inuit values translated into well thought out economic policies. The trend towards realizing the importance of local purchasing capacity, self-reliance, regional alliances leading towards a proto-new world government. That's about it. Okay, so please, some comments. Yeah.
So we can open up now to any Any questions? Any thoughts that were stirred by Dada's talk? I will say for myself, I really appreciate what you've just touched on, kind of finding ways to align and articulate PROUT's approach alongside Indigenous values. I think that's a very important both strategic and kind of emotionally resonant pathway to take, because I do think there is a large movement of young people and just people looking to Indigenous wisdom as a way forward in a time that's so disconnected from our relationship to land and nature. So that part really inspired me, Dada. I'm wondering if others have thoughts they'd like to share.
I'm just wondering, how does artificial intelligence come into all this? Thank you for a very interesting talk, Dara.
Mm.
Mm.
I think the question will be whether everyone benefits from artificial intelligence or not. So if artificial intelligence is owned and dominated by a wealthy minority, then it becomes something that, like any form of technology, it becomes something that is working against the common interests. But then again, artificial intelligence allows people to educate themselves, if they have access to it, much more quickly than they could in the past. So there are some pros as far as being able to use that people who are trying to make progressive changes can also make use of artificial intelligence in ways that it gives them advantages and capacities that they didn't have before. Yeah. Just on a personal level, I thought, we use Guru Mantra. Everything is God. So artificial intelligence is also God. And if you keep that idea in mind, it can create quite an enjoyable interaction. You're having a nice conversation with God and getting all sorts of godlike information. I also reflected that artificial intelligence will never be able to do certain things, like our intuitive capacity to feel links with the divine, our intuitive capacity to feel connected with each other, our kind of neo-humanistic sentiments. And it is these sentiments that are going to be most essential. Our ability to use artificial intelligence will not be able to guide itself in intuitive directions. It won't have neo-humanistic feelings. So the role of human beings will be to bring that neo-humanistic insight and those sentiments, and to utilize artificial intelligence in that way. And interestingly, artificial intelligence can have huge amounts of data and process that data at unimaginable speeds. So unimaginable amounts of data processed and used at unimaginable speed. A human brain can't do that, or can it? Because Baba said that we are all potentially omniscient. Think about that, right? Artificial intelligence cannot ever become omniscient, but a human being can. So while we can use artificial intelligence to process data and information in useful ways, we need to, at the same time, develop our own omniscience or our own progress towards that, so that we can potentially, link to the entire cosmic mind. So I think that's also a message that we should get out there, and that's the importance of spirituality in the sense of, in this world of artificial intelligence. Human beings, our way to, our role in it all is something that artificial intelligence cannot replace or even come near to. And I think there is a fear amongst people that, we will be dominated by machines. But I think this perspective of the spiritual capacity of human beings to be omniscient and, connected neo-humanistically to every single creature and so forth, that is our strength, and that is our reason not to be afraid, and our role that we should cut out for ourselves, so we can use benevolently artificial intelligence in so many different ways, but we exert our intuitive neo-humanistic spiritual role in controlling it. That's my personal take on it. What do you think?
Thank you, Dada. It was interesting to hear your thoughts on this. It's interesting that artificial intelligence, it doesn't necessarily, for example, in health concern, it doesn't necessarily recommend the Western kind of medicine. It's more into, it looks like it's more into untraditional, medicine. It's quite interesting, If you ask the artificial intelligence about cancer, it will not recommend chemo and things like this. It will recommend all kinds of natural healing ways. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think. Anyway.
Okay. What do people think about this idea that kind of the example set by Mark Carney in Canada kind of alliance amongst middle powers. What do you think of that as a kind of maybe the beginnings of a movement towards abandoning the UN or shifting towards a kind of middle power United Nations? Any thoughts about that? I see Gerda Dufoy there. That's something that just dropped in my mind. I was I think probably all of us were inspired by the moral courage that Canada's Prime Minister exhibited in his speeches. But probably he himself doesn't think that this is the beginnings of a new world government. But I don't know. I think that it's as more countries realize this need to form alliances to protect themselves from superpowers, it may be the penny might start to drop. People may start to realize that this is a form of strength that can be developed further. Anandi, any thoughts?
We have a quiet group today.
Yes, a very quiet group, and you don't see the people, just see their names.
Dada, can I ask one question? You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned middle countries. I was not here in the start. What do you mean by that? I came a bit late.
So Canada's reaction to threats from the United States was to, and threats from the United States or tariffs, well, the United States has been Canada's main economic partner, very, very much so, exports, imports, etc. And suddenly that was all thrown into question, and there were threats to make huge tariffs on Canadian imports and so forth. And the United States or Trump expected that Canada would just fold and go along with it, but it didn't. It reached out to Europe, to other countries, to China, and sought to make alliances, both military and economic, to create an alternative. So, find other ways to survive. And so that was one aspect of it. Then, with the threat against Greenland, Denmark also, if it had been alone, it couldn't respond, but it resulted in the Nordic countries making stronger military alliances and stronger economic alliances. There was a strong sense of kind of different countries reaching out to each other and supporting each other, so that in Greenland, the Nordic countries, not only Denmark but other European countries, sent troops there and investment there and other ways of responding. Similarly, with the threat of tariffs, China has reached out to other countries, and it has caused cooperation between Russia and China, and so many different, ways that countries are kind of forming alliances to counteract that aggression in different forms from the United States. So this formation of alliances, sometimes it may be just moral words of support. So what we see was that maybe a couple of years ago, the approach to Trump was appeasement, means just cooperate and somehow make him happy and say things that he likes and that kind of thing. But now the approach, it has changed. There is active resistance, and the resistance, in order to be meaningful, the smaller countries have to unite with each other to resist. And that's what's happening. So what I'm suggesting is that will continue as the great powers, as the United States and China and Russia try to exert their influence in their own spheres. Increasingly, whether it's in Eastern Europe or whether it's, for example, Japan recently said that it would, if China attacked Taiwan, they would not remain inactive.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's interesting.
So that China doesn't have to just think about the United States and Taiwan; it also has to think about Japan and Australia. Spoke when there was the invasion of Greenland. Australia also spoke up. So maybe this is a message for countries in South America also. Countries in South America which are being pushed around by the United States, for example, Venezuela recently. So strength, none of these countries individually can manage that kind of resistance. And whereas, in an out-and-out military conflict, the United States might be able to dominate even a coalition of middle powers. Nevertheless, they would not be able to do so without significant cost to themselves, financially, in terms of loss of life or whatever. So there's been a shift. And countries are no longer just caving in and cooperating by force with Trump. This is a very major, in my mind, it's a very major change. And it indicates middle powers realizing their capacity, which they didn't have before. And I'm wondering where that is going, right? So could it possibly lead to, why aren't people using the United Nations? That's what the United Nations was originally created for. Unfortunately, the good guys who defeated the so-called bad guys in World War II, the good guys gradually became the bad guys themselves, right? So the Security Council, the United States and China and Russia and so forth are becoming the bullies. And their vetoes control the United Nations. So now we need another United Nations that isn't dominated by those powers. Now, Baba talks about world government, and I'm wondering whether this could be a step in that direction that begins as a shared cooperation amongst middle powers. But that cooperation is so strong that eventually the superpowers have to join the join the process.
I have a follow-up question, Dada, if I may. So, wouldn't such a cooperation between middle powers get its strength from each individual country having a stable, decentralized economic unit? That makes sense very much in my mind. What do you think?
Well, yes. In fact, that was one of the things that I was saying. Maybe you joined a bit later.
Yeah, we had
So,
some problem with the link I got from Dada K. She sent us to wrong Zoom meeting. So yeah.
Okay. So, so I made 2 points. One was that although it's not, well, how can I say, although it's not super Proutistic in the sense of, samajas like self-sufficient zones within countries. So, for example, within the United States, there could be many different samajas because there's quite a lot of areas which have similar economic potentialities and the capacity to be self-reliant. There could be different borders within Europe. There could be, say, 2 or 3 samajas within Germany or Scandinavia or whatever. But nevertheless, there is a tendency towards understanding the need for regional self-sufficiency or self-reliance in such a changeable world situation where you may be threatened because of your lack of independence, right? If you depend on the United States for your export markets, and that's the whole basis for your economy, then the United States can easily push you around. But if you have a strong local economy and you don't depend on the US market, then you're not so easily bullied. Similarly, if you have your own domestic supply chain, your own local industries. So Europe and the United States made a mistake to move all their industry to China. And now China can push them around, all right? So having your own industries also is a part of self-reliance. But what some countries are realizing, but Scandinavia as a whole, with its recent tendency towards, let's be more competitive and cut wages and that kind of thing. There's been right-leaning neoliberal governments, especially in Sweden and other places, and currently in Finland, which are reducing the standard of living of the common people in the name of competition and making tax breaks for the rich in the name of competition and so forth. So actually, this is weakening the local economies, and that's what local research and modern research shows, is that actually the economy gets stronger if you increase wages, not decrease them. Okay, so there's new research about that, which is good for PROUT to use. But there are also new examples. And I was quoting Japan, Korea, China, and even Greenland, who are decreasing inequality and who have already realized that it is the power of the local people's purchasing capacity which is essential for them to be able to defend themselves. Right? And if your population is not only weak in terms of purchasing capacity, but so weak that they are on the brink of revolution, then you are even less strong. And one thing I forgot to mention was that at the end of World War II, the United States was worried that communism would take over in Europe and in Japan. And to prevent that from happening, they started something called the Marshall Plan in Europe. So they invested huge amounts of money in Europe to rebuild the economies and make the people happy, put money in their pockets, because if that didn't happen, they would turn to communism, right? And they were successful. There was a very speedy and successful, economic miracle in Germany. And a lot of that was because they didn't do what they did after World War I, which was impose huge penalties on the German people. And that's what led Germany to World War II. So they took the opposite approach. They invested money, they increased the economic standard of the people. And they did that even more in Japan. They divided up the huge companies. They helped people start their individual businesses. They divided up the landowners' land and sold it in smaller plots to smaller farmers. They increased the power of the labor unions. They basically made a PROUTist revolution, a top-down PROUT revolution in Japan. And it is the biggest example of people don't realize, but there was a huge revolution in Japan, but it was imposed by an external power. But the people part of the motivation was for that, so that Japan would not succumb to the influence of Russia and be taken over by communism. So they thought, we have to make the Japanese people economically successful so that they can resist communism. So we need to remember those. Scandinavian or Nordic politicians need to remember that. And European politicians need to remember that if you want, as the revolutionary tendency of the populist movements increases, the way forward is to strengthen the economic capacity of the people. And that's going to be important for, a strong, healthy local demand, an economy that's buzzing along from local demand will be very resistant and strong and in this kind of global uncertainty. So we can use those examples. And these are very, very recent changes in Japan, I'd say in the last 2 years or the last 3 years, but it's already bringing results. So as I said, I quoted that 85 to 90% of Japan's growth in GDP was due to increases in domestic market, not international sales. So they're not trying to be competitive anymore.
Dada, I really appreciate the emphasis on this kind of shift in stance from appeasement to kind of rising up together. And I think there we can all think of many examples of like on the micro and on many different scales of that kind of shift. And the one that is kind of continues to be front of mind for me is in in Minnesota in the US, like when ICE or federal agents coming in to try to deport people, the massive amount of protests that erupted there in response to this ultimately drove out ICE, and so I think that same pattern is reflected in these middle countries, as you say, kind of
Right.
coming together and recognizing their power. I don't know if you probably saw Denmark's petition to buy California.
No, I didn't.
That was like, I saw that and I was like, I live in California. I would be a willing a willing participant. I think there's a karmic something happening karmically with the U.S. and what you said about the South American countries also kind of being emboldened to unite, and the U.S. specifically has exploited and created so much harm in South American countries and Central American countries that I wanted to ask actually related to that, what if any, what kind of relation you see between this conversation and BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now there are a bunch of, I think South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, more countries are joining to kind of create a new economic global order that's not so US centric. So I wonder if there's any overlap or link. They seem slightly different just because BRICS emerged earlier out of from a different place, but I know Lula from Brazil has been a significant player in the development of BRICS. So any comments on that, on kind of how
Yeah,
you see
I
this
guess it's
trend
an earlier example of the same thing.
right? Yeah,
But but it's something that kind of was evolving slowly.
right,
What's interesting now is the pace and the drama.
right,
So this suddenly very physical. I think what was happening in the past is just the evolution of today's situation.
yeah, I agree.
So the globalization was, um, negatively affecting the BRICS countries, and they were trying to do something about it. But now that globalization has shifted to mercantilism, open war in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
and very aggressive threats, both physical and otherwise, tariffs and so forth. So what was kind of, nice on the surface, friendly American diplomacy and things like that, but at the same time, the system was rigged in favor of the dollar and so forth. Um,
Right,
and I would say the same with things like the rule of the approach of the Democrats within the United States. Very nice, but effectively still people were getting poor, and so
right,
and
exactly.
the kind of elites were benefiting, and so it was all the tendencies were there, but not in open confrontation. And now
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Mm-hmm.
shifted. It's it's gone further, and the reactions are also more dramatic.
Mm-hmm. Any last comments or questions before we wrap up? Dada, thank you so much for your time and your engagement on this topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry it was a little bit, kind of disorganized. I think we might have lost some of our more polished participants. But anyway.
That's okay. This is an experiment, this I know, and it was kind of last minute to get it organized. So, but I think it's important to have these spaces to talk a bit. I mean, talk about what is happening, because so much is happening so fast, like you said, and try to understand what the openings are for sharing proud ideas. And any other thoughts, or should we close up? Thank you to all of you for staying until the end. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm really happy to see this type of thing going on, and also really happy to see the YouTube channel,
The
the PROUT
Proudcast.
channel, the
Yeah.
PROUT channel. Is that what it's called? The PROUT
There's
channel,
the
right?
Proutcast is the podcast.
PROUTcast.
Yeah.
PROUTcast. That's really great.
Yeah. I think
Mm.
they've been doing wonderful work with that.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna pause the recording and close the meeting. Namaskar, Dada.
Namaskar.